Well, all right. Thank you all for coming. It's glad to see you. I'll just alert you. I've just arrived from China last night, so I'm going through jet lag. But I will do my best not to nod off. And the topic is interesting enough that I think that won't happen. But just to give you fair warning, I'm really pleased to be able to do this. This has been one of my favorite projects here since I've been at CSIS. It's actually the fourth in a series that the Scholl Chair has done on advanced technologies. My predecessor, Scott Miller, began with drones and autonomous vehicles. And then he began, and I concluded one on additive manufacturing or 3D printing. And now this fourth one is on blockchain. One of the things that the Scholl Chair focuses on is advanced technologies and their role in international business and the trade policy implications of those technologies. So I'm delighted that we're going to be able to present this one for you today. I should say that this project is done with the generous support of IBM, which is one of the leaders in the blockchain field, and we're very grateful for their support and their interest in our work. The technology, I imagine most of you know enough about it to make you want to come here and learn more, I think is these days, like a lot of other things in advanced technology areas, being touted as a transformational technology that's going to change everything. And the question, of course, is that true? And the answer is we're going to find out, because that's what Caddy is going to be talking about, and then that's what we're going to be discussing. Clearly, when you see the report, you'll see that it can have dramatic changes in certain areas or selected areas. My favorite personal example, which is mentioned in the report, is Walmart's use of blockchain to track the production chain, if you will, for fresh produce, which matters a lot if you have an E. coli outbreak or something like that. You want to be able to figure out where, your fruits and vegetables came from and if they're affected by this. And the example that came up was in the case of mangoes, not my favorite fruit, but a good story anyway, that through the use of blockchain, Walmart was able to cut the time of being able to trace the product, the full chain of mango production from the farm to the store from nearly 1 week to 2 seconds, which is a remarkable change and really is a transformational technology. What I think we'll see, though, is that this is not a technology that is all things to all people at all times, that it has a number of very useful applications, a lot of potential, but it also faces a number of challenges that we will also be discussing, and I think will be also a source for some of the questions that I expect that we will get. I should be clear in the beginning that we have specifically focused on non-currency applications of blockchain. One of the things, this is the Scholl Chair in International Business, and we want to focus on, as I said, advanced manufacturing and technologies and things like that. Blockchain has gotten caught up into the Bitcoin phenomenon, and we're simply not going to comment on that or go down that road. We think that the long-term, more significant applications of blockchain are in non-currency areas, and this report focuses entirely on those. So if you've come expecting a lecture on Bitcoin or Ethereum, you're going to be disappointed. So with that, let me turn to our speakers. And what we're going to do is our author is going to present the paper, and as befitting the technology, we don't have hard copies for you. I have one. It may be the only one because I'm a 20th century person, not a 21st century person. But at the end of her presentation, we're going to provide a link, and you'll be able to get it off of the CSIS website as well. And we hope you will all do that. I'm going to introduce our two speakers who will present, and then when they're done, the two of them and our third guest will come up here and we'll have a conversation amongst ourselves, and then we will then turn to audience questions. And then we'll have, when we're done, we'll have some refreshments out in the whatever that area is called out there. So our author and chief presenter is Kati Suominen, who is founder and CEO of Next Trade Group, which helps governments, multilateral development banks, and Fortune 500 companies optimize public policy and lending strategies in support of trade and digitization. She's also the founder of Trade Up Capital Fund, which is a growth capital platform for globalizing tech companies. She's the founder of Business for E-Trade Development, which is a nonprofit backed by leading global companies on a mission to advance e-commerce in developing nations, and co-founder of the new Singapore-based Digital Standards for Trade, which aims to digitize international trade transactions end-to-end. She's an adjunct fellow here at CSIS, and we're very glad to have her. She's an adjunct professor at UCLA, where she teaches international business economics and global digital disruption, and she is served as a senior advisor to the G20-launched World SME Forum. Kati has published over 100 articles and 9 books, and is working on her 10th, which is going to be called, commercial here, and sort of timely, Making Trade Great Again: How Disruptive Technologies Open Opportunities for All. So we're all going to have red hats that say MTGA and not MAGA. So Kati is going to be our presenter and is going to present the report to you, and she's got some slides to do that. Following her, we're going to hear from Marie Week, who has spent more than 25 years with IBM and is currently their general manager of IBM Blockchain, which involves being responsible for their worldwide business in that area, including participation in the open source Hyperledger project, its enterprise IBM blockchain platform, and transformative industry solutions, including IBM Food Trust, TradeLens, and Global Payments. Marie has an MBA from NYU, an MS in computer science from Columbia, a bachelor's degree in engineering from the Cooper Union. She's a member of IEEE and also the Society of Women Engineers, which I hope is a large and growing group. Finally, we are very lucky to be joined in the conversation afterwards by Robert Holliman, who's an old friend and actually is the person who suggested to us that we do this way back when we had lunch in the winter. Robert is currently the president and CEO of C&M International and also a partner in the Kroll and Moorings International Trade Group. He previously, or most previously, was Deputy United States Trade Representative in the second Obama term, where he had the rank of ambassador and was responsible for U.S. trade and investment relations with Asia and with regional institutions, including APEC. He led their negotiations with China, including the work of the annual JCCT Forum, and with India through the U.S.-India Trade Policy Forum. He was responsible for global trade policy in services, investment, IP, and innovation, which makes sense if you know that before that he spent 23 years as a president and CEO of BSA, the Software Alliance, which he transformed from an early-stage enterprise into a global association representing the world's software powerhouses across 65 countries with 16 foreign offices. I wish I could have done that with the National Foreign Trade Council. That would have been cool. Before that, Robert has done a number of things, but following my own past, he also was a Hill veteran, for which I always have great admiration for Hill people, and he in fact worked for one of my heroes, which most of you are too young to remember, which is the late Senator Russell Long from Louisiana, who was one of the great legislators of all time, and I learned a lot. I didn't work for him, but I worked alongside him with somebody else on the Finance Committee, and not only enjoyed the opportunity, but found myself learning an awful lot about how to get things done in a legislative process. He was a master at that for a very long time, and in many ways I think these are skills that we miss these days. But that's an editorial that we'll save for another occasion. In any event, I'm glad you're all here, and I'm looking forward to the presentation. So we'll start with Kati, and then we'll go forward. Oh, there you are.
Great. Thanks so much, Bill, and thank you all for coming. Great to have such a great audience. I also want to thank IBM before we get started. It's been a fantastic project. I've learned a lot. And we also had a fantastic working group. A lot of people are here from our working group, and that was actually a working group that did a lot of work. And we're really thrilled by that. And the report reflects a lot of the comments from those people. I wanted to take a little stock of the room first before we get started. How many people here work on blockchain, kind of 50% to 100% of your time in business, policy, academia? Right, few hands. How about 10 to 50% sometime? And the rest, a little bit here and there, looking to learn? Okay, most of you. Very good. That's very helpful. I think, given the audience, this seems very timely for a lot of people for different reasons. And it certainly has been timely for us here at CSIS for, let's see, for a number of, there we go, for a number of reasons, perhaps 3 reasons. One is precisely what Bill mentioned. This is not only Bitcoin. Bitcoin is, of course, enabled by blockchain, but blockchain is much more. However, the debate out there is a lot about Bitcoin. If you Google Bitcoin, you get 345 million results. And if you Google blockchain, you get 155 million results. And we feel that this is rather lopsided. It doesn't perhaps describe well how many applications blockchain enables. And we want to change that and raise debate about particularly the enterprise applications of blockchain. The second reason why we focus on this is that in the past couple of years, there has been an explosion of pilots and use cases of blockchain, also empowered by IBM in many cases, that have been very promising, that show great gains. And we wanted to look under the hood and see what those gains are and what the policy concerns and issues are that those raise. And the third reason is to focus on this is that we haven't seen a great deal of debate in the United States yet on what US policy should be on blockchain. As I started work on this here with Bill and others, I was struck by the fact that there was rather little out there as yet on what US policy should be with this technology, which I deem transformative for a lot of areas of life. So we wanted to also start that debate and, of course, get a great group of people like you together to help us navigate and harvest also your ideas. So this is a starting point to kick off some ideas, and we look forward very much to your take. For those of you who are less familiar, let me put couple of use cases out there just for you to get a feel for what blockchain actually does. So every year, 48 million Americans get sick from foodborne illnesses. 3,000 die. Spinach, lettuce carry some of those illnesses, and we've heard a number of those cases. Every year there's something in the news about those. And Bill mentioned Walmart. Well, Walmart is now requiring that its spinach and lettuce providers, suppliers, get on a blockchain catalog where this produce comes from. And in 2020, they also require that the farmers and the logistics providers of this produce get on the blockchain as well, precisely to enhance the traceability of lettuce. So let's imagine that there's a spinach related food outbreak somewhere in America. How can we quickly trace the origin of that spinach in order to not to have to recall millions of pounds of spinach out there? We can recall just one batch, and perhaps also target the weakest links in the supply chain. Perhaps there's always contaminated spinach coming from a given supplier or a given farmer, and this enables Walmart to do that. And as Bill mentioned, Walmart had a very successful case in tracing mangoes and other produce in the past. This same technology, of course, would enable customs to trace products and produce in different countries, suppliers in different countries, as well as to verify origin in customs, very tricky procedure. And US Customs is piloting on blockchain, has identified 14 use cases for blockchain in customs. Another use case, medical records. Well, these are getting bit by bit digitized, which is all good news. However, you can think of medical records All of you may have a couple of doctors. You may have had different doctors in different states, perhaps in different countries. Maybe you had a skiing incident in Europe or diving incident in Mexico, what have you. And you have medical events that are cataloged in different parts of different countries, medical systems, or in different states. You may have fitness apps that produce data on your health regularly. You may take vitamins in the morning. And all of these data streams, if you will, are in different parts of the system. Some of them are not even cataloged as data. And wouldn't it be great to have a holistic picture, bring all this data together, all these records together in one place, and for you to have a portable record of everything related to your health? There is an entity at MIT called MedRec that is bringing all medical data and records together for the user to have a portfolio, if you will, in one place of their medical records and to then supply to their healthcare provider whatever they want to provide. Another application, well, here we are next week, all of us voting there. This is a wonderful picture in that a lot of people are voting and the booths are full. At the same time, if you're a 15-year-old or 25-year-old, probably a lot of you in the room would say, well, why aren't they voting, walking down the street on their mobile phone? And there is an opportunity to use blockchain also for voting electronically, securing the votes, reducing the cost of voting as well. Estonia is using blockchain in voting, saving 11,000 days, worker days, in every voting instance that they have, just by using blockchain and voting electronically. And some of you may have done what I did, deposit your ballot in mail, and you just hope that the mail takes it there and your vote is counted and your vote is anonymous, and blockchain would enable also that. So there's a startup called Votem that did a blockchain pilot in West Virginia, enabling particularly the overseas military, of which only 20% vote, to vote electronically using blockchain. And it was a very successful pilot, so hopefully we'll see more of these. Other countries have certainly piloted also in this, Indonesia being the case in point. There are many, many other applications, and I'm sure we'll discuss those. For instance, the governor of Dubai is bringing 100 million of government records on blockchain by 2020. And these will involve things like, license renewals or payments to the government or visa applications or what have you, all kinds of documents. And they estimate that they will save in this process 25 million worker hours every year by bringing blockchain on, bringing these records on blockchain. Standard Chartered in trade finance used blockchain Ripple application in payment with another bank to conclude a trade finance transaction. That transaction went through in 10 seconds compared to 48 hours that it usually takes. US Navy has piloted with blockchain in tracing the origin and the quality of 3D printed parts and components that the Navy is using. So these are proliferating. They are all over the place across industries and showing tremendous efficiency gains. And where I think this is particularly exciting is kind of three areas. One is that blockchain enables data sharing among parties that are kind of disparate parties that need access to the same data at the same time. Classic case would be border protection, where a lot of different border agencies need the same data on the same shipment at the same time, yet their databases are not necessarily all harmonized or interoperable, and blockchain enables that. Another area where this can be very transformative is among buyers and sellers or among parties that do not necessarily trust each other, but want to transact with one another. You can think of lenders and borrowers, or exporters and importers, or buyers or sellers of, I don't know, used cars that will be able to look at these assets and look at each other's track record and performance on blockchain and go from there. Essentially, we can create new markets using this wonderful technology. And the third area is kind of breaking assets into pieces, tokenizing assets, where all of us can securely buy and sell pieces of, say, high-rise or solar energy that we generate on our rooftops and what have you. And that's another exciting application that I think is only starting to take off. Investors are getting pretty excited about blockchain. This is global venture capital and angel investments in blockchain. The blue line is the number of deals per year that investors have invested in, and the orange bars are the millions of dollars that have gone in. So in the past 3 years, we see $1.7 billion in over 500 deals, 500 more or less. If you take deals that involve initial coin offerings that are funded that way, these bars go up 5 times. So in blockchain startups. So there's a lot more investment than this indicates. But the point here is that there has been an accentuated interest in the past couple of years in this technology, perhaps given the exciting use cases that we're seeing. Now, companies are realizing that blockchain is most impactful when everybody plays together. The whole system operates and companies can come together and play with one another. There's multiple industry consortia. This was actually very interesting to see how many companies and how many industries are coming together to use blockchain and create common standards in such areas as terminology. What do we mean by different terms? Smart contracts or blockchain, what do those terms mean, and certain more technical terms as well, to harmonize the language that they speak. The second major area that perhaps consortia are working on standardizing is the technology, what technologies they are using, and then how they are governing data, if they are sharing data with one another. So I'll give you a couple of examples. In trade finance, we have a couple of consortia. WeTrade is a consortium started by a number of banks in Europe, in particular, to do trade finance transactions much more efficiently. Trade finance is a notoriously paper-based, manual, inefficient system where exporters and importers bear high costs because of the inefficiencies still in the banking system. And banks have come together and wanted to change this. And WeTrade just made a great pilot this summer. Another, let's see here, something off with my, let's see, how do I get out of this? This is something blockchain will not solve maybe, but let me see. Our tech guys. Do you know how to fix the, excuse me. Oh, there we go. That was simple. Thank you. Another one in transportation. So a number of transport companies. This is just a handful of examples. There are actually dozens and dozens in this blockchain in transport alliance, including FedEx, UPS, the household names that have come together to establish common standards in transport. How do we use blockchain in transport and logistics, supply chains, when you think of things like interoperability, multimodal transport systems. The third area, pretty exciting, that I just discovered is for energy. There's a lot of parties in energy, utilities, individuals that are generating energy in their households, a number of technology companies in energy, and they have also come together to pilot, discuss use cases, have conferences with one another to talk about blockchain in this space. And this is just a handful of the industry consortia that are out there. So companies have realized that, hey, there's a lot of opportunity here with this technology, and together we need everybody on the same blockchain, on the same page, in order to interoperate better, in order to draw those efficiencies from our community. Now, what's interesting is, there's a survey every year done by Deloitte looking at blockchain and how companies are using blockchain. And they survey 1,000 executives across industries, in oil and gas, in automotive, in financial services, you name it. It's a wide set of industries. And they look at different countries and how executives are using blockchain in their companies. And what's interesting about this, this year, 2018, when they did this, is that the United States executives seem to be kind of warming up more slowly than blockchain than executives in other countries. So 38% of American executives say blockchain is currently in production or there's a plan for production next year, whereas 91% of executives in China say that, and 94% in Mexico and 88% in the UK say that. So it seems like a lot of other countries, whether they're advanced countries or kind of less advanced countries, emerging markets, are really enthused about blockchain, and we're not. You might question how representative this survey is. It has 250 American companies, but it's quite interesting that we're still a little bit behind, if you will, in using this or in our enthusiasm for this. The same, if you ask these companies, is your organization investing or replacing parts of all of your existing systems with blockchain-based enhancements now or in the future? Again, US companies are not that enthusiastic yet. Yet we're seeing wonderful use cases across the United States with startups, and certainly we have some of the greatest technology companies that are providing blockchain technology. Well, one of the reasons why American companies may be kind of warming up slowly to this are these issues. When companies were asked, well, what holds you back from investing in blockchain or moving into it, they cite regulatory issues, the kind of moving from a legacy system. This may be very much the American case, where we already have good technologies and digital technologies in a number of areas compared to other, less advanced economies that can kind of leapfrog on the blockchain. We may have to have a little bit more time to tear down the existing legacy systems that are performing quite well as is. And companies are also worried about security threats in this space. So to break down a little bit some of those questions that companies may have, and we're laying out this in our report. We have kind of 10 questions and myths that are surrounding blockchain. Some of those relate to user identity, data, privacy. I know Marie is going to talk about these very difficult issues, so I'm glad she's taking the tough questions. Whether the data going into blockchain is good. Well, that's a perennial question with any database. If it's a human being putting in the data, is that data going to be, is he or she going to log in the data well? Is that data going to be honest, if you will? And so forth. This can be mitigated to some extent with technology. You just have machines put in the data in an objective fashion, or it can be mitigated with technology as well. There are some technologies that are able to assess whether the data is actually good that goes in by looking at whether there are anomalies in the data. Another question is whether smart contracts that automate transactions, for instance in trade finance, are actually that smart. Well, they're not necessarily that smart. They don't necessarily know how to assess whether parties are acting in good faith or whether parties are acting with some kind of reasonableness standard and so forth. They are as good as the writers of these smart contracts. So I think there is still a bit of learning between a human and a machine to understand how to best operate smart contracts so that they execute contracts as people would like them to execute them. Another question, big question out there, is who is liable for blockchain entries, particularly the kind of private permission blockchain. Is it the blockchain manager that's liable for everything that happens on the blockchain? Is it the users? Who is it? In permissionless systems like Bitcoin, it's even harder in the sense that nobody really owns the system. So these are very thorny questions about the liability. The other question that I hear a lot, particularly in the trade finance world, is this digital islands problem, that if we have one industry consortia here and another one here, and they use different technologies and they have different standards in trade finance, can their members then interoperate, or are they stuck in their walled gardens and can only play with one another? Case of WeTrade, and then some of these Asia-based consortia that I've been part of building as well. And then there's the big question of, will this take my job? Is this a technology that will like AI and all these other technologies we're so fearful will take our jobs as well. So I think we'll discuss that more when we go into our Q&A. So some of the policy recommendations that we came up with in our working group and in this project, perhaps answering in part to some of those questions that we're just asking. One is that we need common standards. There's still not common language among blockchain users. Technologies, different technology platforms use this terminology somewhat differently. And we don't necessarily share agreements or share understandings of how to manage, for instance, data and data sharing in different companies and in consortia and so forth. So we need common standards. Now, the International Standards Organization is working on blockchain standards, and it's a major effort that they are doing, and certainly a lot of industries, as we saw, a lot of industry consortia and companies have come together to establish their own standards. So there are standards efforts on the way. What we want to ensure is that these standards are going to be kind of global, and we're not going to be fragmented by national standards, as China is doing its own standards, and maybe the Europeans are doing their own standards, but rather we have common global language that will enable American companies, American businesses to operate globally. The second policy recommendation we have is kind of a broad idea of regulatory flexibility and certainty. This is a very new technology, and we don't necessarily see a reason to regulate. We don't know a lot yet about the applications of blockchain or the challenges. And a lot of the technology issues, kind of privacy, security issues, those are technology issues that technology companies are solving. And a lot of existing American laws will apply probably to many of those questions. For instance, on data privacy, they will probably apply to a good extent to questions related to blockchain. So I think we need to take stock of the existing laws and how they might apply. We haven't done that in this particular paper. It would be a huge effort, but I'm sure there's talent in the room that can do that. The other idea we had is to establish a blockchain safe harbor. What happened in the 1990s was we had a law or a regulation in the United States that provided safe harbor for internet intermediaries like social media platforms and others from the user-generated content on their platforms. So, Facebook is not necessarily liable for everything that its users say on Facebook. And this rule, Communications Decency Act, enabled the growth of the American internet ecosystem, I would argue, and so do others. And we believe that the similar kind of concept could be applied to blockchain, where blockchain platforms and managers are not liable for everything that happens on a blockchain. And this may enable then more investments in blockchain and more use cases and applications. We also think there's a role for blockchain sandbox, and I know Marie is going to probably educate us more about that. There are examples around the world already of this concept where companies can come and introduce technologies and then not have to comply with all regulatory requirements that otherwise might pertain. This is applied, this concept of a sandbox is, of course, many of you know, applied very widely in fintech, in financial technologies, where companies can come and experiment. Regulators can look how the market unfolds, say, in the course of 24 months, and can go from there. So this enables kind of experimentation, learning by doing, both for the companies and regulators. And the fourth area that we thought kind of in this regulatory box is to think of assessments of state laws. There's a lot of states, Arizona, Vermont, that have gone and created laws on blockchain and defined blockchain very helpfully. Some have defined smart contracts, have defined that smart contracts are to be used, are to have powering cord and so forth. So it might be useful if we're wanting to regulate to also assess what the state laws are. Something that came up in our working group is that there isn't yet a lot of pressure or push from companies around America to have kind of federal standards, that it's fine to have these all flowers bloom model with state standards and state laws springing up, and companies are not as yet complaining that this doesn't enable us to operate across states. That time may come, but it doesn't seem to be here yet, so it may be useful to go step by step and assess what the state laws say. A couple of more recommendations, and then I'll stop, is to accelerate blockchain development. through federal funding? Why not allocate some funding? And I'm sure government is doing a number of things in this space with the Navy, with the Customs, with Department of Homeland Security and others. And perhaps we can systematize this and fund public-private partnerships in this space to develop new use cases across areas in defense, intelligence, trade enforcement, healthcare, and so forth, and also to invest some in the encryption technologies and security technologies. We still have to develop those. There are some fragilities in the system, and we as the United States should be focused also on that. I think blockchain can provide tremendous efficiencies, particularly great gains for developing countries in a number of areas. And developing countries can leapfrog on this technology and digitize a number of their paper-based operations, digitize a lot of industries, gain a lot. And I think we could form a blockchain for development fund, if you will, that funds blockchain development across, perhaps World Bank projects or other development bank projects, could also backstop other funds that we have founded. For instance, the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation that funds customs modernization around the world. Why not use a blockchain fund and then backstop the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation with those funding to modernize customs and use blockchain in customs around the world, as done widely already in Korea, in Singapore, in Peru, Mexico, Costa Rica. All of them are experimenting on this. 15 countries in Africa are using blockchain in customs, just as a sidebar. And the final thing that came up in our working group over and over again was that we need to educate, that there's still kind of lack of awareness of the gains of blockchain with regulators or government officials, and certainly with small businesses. So one could think of even a nice kind of prize or competition sponsored by SBA and Commerce Department to catalyze the use cases among small businesses of blockchain, and certainly to apply this more widely, say, in elections and other processes. So those are our recommendations. We'll love comments and hearing your feedback, and I guess I'll pass to Marie to discuss some of the challenges.
Thanks, Kati. Very good insights on the kinds of use cases, and we would agree from our perspective. We have seen, since we started in blockchain, which is now over 4 years ago, and we formed a unit specifically focusing on blockchain almost 2 years ago now, use cases in every industry, in every geography, across all types of processes. And I haven't seen this much enthusiasm around a new technology since the early days of the internet. And I think the same kind of transformative opportunities do present themselves here. But I think it does require both a little backdrop and a little perspective on what we would describe as the principles of blockchain in order to capitalize on that opportunity and that advantage. And if I just wind back a little, there is a lot of discussion on blockchain and the relationship to cryptocurrencies. But at the end of the day, blockchain is a distributed database, and it all relies upon the flow of data. And if you just think about data for a second, in the last 2 years, we have generated more digital data than in human history. And it is accelerating with new sources, both from machine learning and AI, from autonomous vehicles, from Internet of Things. The sources and uses of data are increasing. And in this very, very digitizing world, the trust in that data is becoming more and more of a question. And if you look at sentiment, all the trust indices, say that trust levels, whether it's in government or enterprises or NGOs, is at an all-time low, the lowest in the United States this year than in more than a decade. And a lot of it has to do with trust and transparency. And about almost over a year ago, we put in place a set of guiding principles around data forget blockchain for a second, but around data itself, that was very much centered on that data should augment, not replace, human insights and human activity, that is an enabler, not a replacement for appropriate decision-making, that the data should be, the right to that data, the access of that data is owned by the source. And that extends to the creator of any insights of that source data as well. And that there is a natural requirement here to extend, just as we were saying, education in this regard, so that there is transparency in how decisions are made on that data, that there is a cause and effect on that. And we've been continuing to take those principles and now turn them into, essentially what a set of responsibility and a set of tools. Those responsibilities include education. They extend to how do you license software to adhere to data? How do you protect personal information? All of those become very essential elements of a technology strategy. And new innovations like our AI OpenScale to really identify biases and how models are coming out with answers are just part of that track. But now enter blockchain. So in that landscape, now you have not only a proliferation of broad-scale data, but you also are distributing it, sharing it, extending it in many new and distinct ways that is causing the digitization of core processes. And when you think about now applying data in a digital form to trade, to economic policy, to other aspects that governments around the world care about, there are really three distinct types of value chains in the world. There's the flow of goods. That could be physical goods or digital goods. There's the flow of information that goes along with those goods. That could be a title, a stock certificate, an education diploma. And there's the flow of money. And the money goes with the flow of value and generally is triggered by an exchange of one of those other flows. But they are all separate and distinct processes right now. They are not connected. And even in digital value chains like EDI systems, you only have visibility for one up and one down in your value chain, and they tend to think of them as linear flows of messages. And at the end of the day, that's really what the internet is too. All of our digital communications and connections are point-to-point. Even when you talk about a social network or a marketplace, you are doing that point-to-point with a hub in the middle. That hub could be a commercial enterprise, it could be a government agency, it could be a facilitator in the form of an NGO or a nonprofit. But it's still point-to-point, which means you have to trust that person in the middle. And what we see as very really transformative is the notion that now if you have a distributed database, a distributed model, where you can fold those end-to-end value chains kind of on themselves and have everyone have visibility to that data at the same time, you can really affect very broad-scale changes in the way processes are run, the way digital operations, and it affects the efficiency and the speed. Many of the use cases and examples cut down time because you're essentially eliminating a middleman. You're cutting down cost. But we did our own Institute for Business Value survey last year, almost 3,000 C-suite executives. And of all the early adopters in those survey results, 66% of them said they were interested in blockchain not for the savings, not for the cost or time. It was for new business model opportunities, the ability to grow and extend new value sources coming from data. And we think that that's really the ultimate transformative point. But when you think about Now, the responsibility that that entails when you have this kind of transformative technology happening right now, again, we think that there are some core principles that have to be brought to bear. And the first is really having the opportunity to have a really open and inclusive technology base. So we think that means you really need, at the core foundation of this, open source, that facilitates an open and inclusive access to anyone who can further innovate, extend, and grow the technology. That accelerates adoption. But open source, not all open source is created equal as well. You know, just because I'll take a piece of software and put it out on the web and let somebody access it doesn't mean it's inclusive, doesn't mean it has an open governance model, doesn't necessarily mean even that the licensing terms can be extended and used in any of the applications that you may need. So we tend to advise people to look carefully at a community model that actually says, how are changes accepted? What is the licensing term? How broad is the community? Is it centered on, you know, one individual, one country, one company? Then you may want to think about more broad scale approaches and try to get that real community involvement. If you've got now an open technology base, what about the key thoughts around permission and trusted access? Many of the open communities that are involved in blockchain and cryptocurrency really started with the notion of anonymity, that these were anonymous participants. And in an enterprise context, we find, ourselves included, we want to know who we're doing business with. That doesn't mean closed, that means identified participation, where there is an identity to the individual or the companies that are participating and a known set of capabilities that go along with that. A key element of that permissioning means that you need an identity mechanism itself. And there are emerging standards in that space, DID, sovereign.org, a number of other things that let you get at the notion of, I am Marie Week as participating in this particular use case, this network, this exchange of goods or value or services, and that I can then use that same identity in other places. The cost and time that enterprises today spend on know your customer and anti-money laundering, or know your supplier regulatory requirements, and how those differ country to country are an enormous time constraint and cost to doing business. If it could be done in a shared context with common standards such that that is a model, then you have a very accelerating effect on participation of members into these networks. That comes, however, with another responsibility, which is on access and privacy. If now your data is not just your data, but shared with everyone else who's on your network, how do you really think about things like GDPR, like personal information? And in general, our recommendation is that you do not put personal information on the blockchain, which is immutable and lasts forever. You know, there are issues around right to be forgotten and other aspects. But a great thing to put on it is the permissioning. I have granted the use of my healthcare data for research on clinical drug trials. I have granted my permission to participate in a particular commerce transaction or other event. And because the blockchain generally is encrypted, this information can be controlled in terms of who has access on the blockchain. And there are different mechanisms for privacy, channels of operation that can separate different competitors or different rights access. But it provides a consistent mechanism to really ensure both that permissioned and trusted access across the model. The other key piece of that, though, if openness of technology is one access and now you have permissioning, the biggest challenge we see in all of our projects is not on the technology, it's on governance. And Kati mentioned this as well. There are multiple different models when you now have a permission system for how you set up these ecosystems of participants. We see consortiums like some of the ones that were described where there's a new joint venture. We see founder-led networks where a company may bring their customers or their suppliers and actually own the cost and expense of driving it with the permission of the participants. And we also see alliances and open source committees, if you will, who are extending now the use of that technology to their members. But the most important piece of that is the trust model. How many trust anchors, how many copies of the data do you have in the network? Who controls how new members are added? Who controls the smart contract and smart contract changes and coverage models? That ultimately is the level of trust in a network, is the transparency and the extension of those networks. And just because they are permissioned doesn't mean they're private. Most of the ones that we've talked about, like the Food Trust Network that Walmart is on, is open to any participant to join. We just want to know who you are. And to find these networks, there are some new technology as well. We've been working with a company called Acera, who has a registry. You know, just like you search the internet to find a website, you can search this to find a blockchain network and how to join it. And that kind of democratization of these permission networks, we think will expand and extend. Another key point is data flows. If you now have a distributed network with distributed data, we believe in blockchain everywhere, that you can have those participation and those trust anchors, those trust nodes anywhere in the world. But if you now have a regulatory posture that requires data to remain resident within your country walls, within your borders, do these closed gardens actually restrict trade and reduce the benefits? We have a number of mechanisms where we can put, nodes on premise or within a country and then fence that data, but have a connection to another network in another country. But at the end of the day, it restricts data flow, it restricts trade. You have to be mindful of the regulatory posture in each of those places and what visibility is there. But an alternative is really one of providing auditors and regulators access so they become a trust node or a trust anchor in the network as well and help facilitate in some of these sandbox opportunities that extension. And the last point that I think is really important is to consider the notion of robustness and resilience of these networks. If they are now becoming a foundation for trade, for payments, for health information, and it's still very early days in the formation of this technology and adoption, you need to take a very modular approach to that technology so that when new innovation occurs, you can swap out one piece without disrupting the entire network. You need to think about how you're testing smart contracts and smart contract coverage model. A very classic use case that everybody studies is the DAO attack and how that smart contract flaw, if you will, was able to siphon off money from that particular crypto network. So test coverage, modularity, the ability to use other new technologies like machine learning and artificial intelligence to actually test the data before it goes on to an immutable ledger. Is this data compliant with a standard? Have a bot or have a process to test it first before you extend it. And can you make updates to those networks and models while all the members are still active and participating? So those are some of the things that we've seen from across now over 500 different engagements. And there's a lot of content on how to think of the practical considerations. We've provided a founder's handbook of things to think about in scaling your network, in progressing the capabilities. But at the end of the day, it really is one where The technology has to be fit for purpose with the use case that you are looking at, and continue to look at standards both for compliance as well as for interoperability, so that you can layer on more and extended value from each one of those networks. So I hope that helps, and I will now invite the rest of my colleagues here for some questions that you may have. Thank you.
Focus primarily on an issue that we alluded to but didn't discuss in depth in the presentations, and that's international regulations. Kati mentioned the work of ISO in developing standards, and we can talk about standards, but let's begin by talking about regulation. This may be an area like others in advanced technologies where governments may not be able to resist stepping in and regulating, and then that raises the question of above and beyond the domestic challenges in the United States, which we'll get to if we have time, but it raises the question of what happens if we have countries that have different and conflicting regulations about how blockchain is going to operate in their country. So let me begin by asking you all, and maybe I should start with Robert if he's willing, because he hasn't had a chance to say anything yet. Is this a big issue? Is the idea of international inconsistency going to be a problem? Are there other governments out there that are going down this road faster than we are? And is it a problem? And if so, from an American perspective, what do we do about it?
Thank you, Bill, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this discussion. I think for policymakers, this is a sort of a seminal question around how do you allow this new technology to proliferate? How do policymakers sort of resist the urge to regulate prematurely? And finally, because of the fundamental nature of this distributed ledger technology, how does this work on a global basis? So I'd say there's sort of two things to this. One, apart from sort of the fundamental of do no harm, which I think is the role of policymakers. Two, how do you look at the potentially conflicting approaches that are happening? So I think the standard setting process is an extremely big part of that. We've seen in trade barriers in the past where countries have adopted a national standard that can be a trade barrier that prohibits the proliferation of new technologies. We need to resist that and move towards the type of things like the standards that are being set globally through standard setting bodies. I think secondly, we need to look at the opportunity around new trade agreements. I'll be happy to talk about this later. I think there are a lot of things in new trade facilitation agreements, anti-corruption provisions, transparency provisions that we see both in the new US MCA, the new NAFTA, we see in the TPP, which will now come into force at the end of this year, that are opportunities for government to embrace how blockchain can help them fulfill those goals. And finally, I look at the question of if a government's going to regulate, you should focus on the way in which it's used, not the underlying technology. We don't have a law around internal combustion engines. We have laws around fuel efficiency or safety. We didn't have a law around the law of the horse, when the horse was the primary means of transportation, but we did have how you used it for various things. So governments need to do that, and finally they have to be learn and educate. And I think this report by CSIS is a great contribution to that.
Do we inevitably run into differences with other countries? The EU, for example, I think, has a long history in other areas of much more prescriptive regulations than what you're describing. Is a conflict in this area inevitable or not?
No, I think we're already starting to see some conflicts. That's why the standards process is important. And then finally, I think what we have to look for in all this is interoperability. I mean, we know that no one country, no group of, it's not going to be a single standard, it's not going to be a single approach. But what we need to have is interoperable systems. So for example, the GDPR, which is a very heavy-handed approach to privacy, has some potentially harmful implications in the blockchain for how that's utilized. Whereas more flexible privacy frameworks like the APEC cross-border privacy rules, the US approach, can allow these new technologies to proliferate. That doesn't mean that the EU is going to give up the GDPR, but what we need to recognize is we need to have interoperable systems where you can have different approaches but still accomplish the same goal, and I think that's what you need around blockchain.
Do either of you want to comment on whether that's possible or not, feasible?
Certainly the opportunity for interoperability is heavily discussed. There's a lot of work already that the Hyperledger community has been doing between Ethereum and Hyperledger. So I think one network will never rule them all, but there is clearly benefit to the more global standardization that there is. We don't have multiple standards on the internet, and we've certainly seen how that has facilitated trade and communication. But I think the most important part of your comments is not even what regulation and what interoperability, but that there is some level of clarity. Kati's data that she highlighted that US is lower, I think is in part because there is less certainty on the regulatory climate around blockchain, which agencies are actually responsible for setting it and how it affects currency versus security versus identity. Whereas while GDPR is very rigid, it's clear. And people know what it is, so they know how to, address it. And we have seen more adoption relative to overall opportunity in Western Europe and in Japan and in Singapore, where the government has been very clear on what they think the policy is, even if it's not the same. And I think that fuels, that kind of certainty fuels a certain amount of economic expansion.
Do you see, any of you see efforts underway now inside the United States to deal with that problem and to clarify the regulatory situation and also to deal with potentially conflicting state regulations?
Well, certainly the Blockchain Caucus and a lot of the work that has been going on, I think is, educating and evolving the situation. I think there's still certain states are further ahead than others. That creates an economic magnet in certain ideas, but if you really want broad adoption, I think one of the starting points is around identity, so that you could actually have some interoperability even with different use cases or different regulations state by state.
Robert, you want to?
I'll just say a great new contribution is there's a new NIST report out of the Commerce Department that was released last month. We've seen previously in areas around cybersecurity standards and frameworks that the NIST contributions have been substantial. I think this is an important contribution, and we see a lot of other countries looking at what NIST does because of its history of objectivity. So I think we are making things as a government. Probably have some work to catch up with others.
Well, okay, that was going to be my next question. It seems to me it's hard for the United States to lead globally if we don't know what we're doing domestically. So the faster we can deal with the latter, the more important, the better positioned we will be internationally to achieve the kind of results that we want if we know what it is that we want. Does that matter that we're not leading? Is there a first mover advantage from a government standpoint here? Or can we arrive later and still have things turn out the way we want?
I think there's a first mover advantage, and the U.S. can really realize that when our government adopts it more broadly to facilitate its mission. We're the largest purchaser of IT in the world is the U.S. government. And so when the U.S. government, whether it's customs or ensuring supply chain integrity or helping fulfill goals in our new trade agreements, adopts it in a very robust fashion, that in and of itself will make a big difference. I also think, but I also, I strongly urge that we resist the notion that we need to over-regulate the space. And so I think there could be certainty around contracts, how they work. I mean, we had a lot of our clients coming to us, asking us for advice around how do they take traditional regulatory structures for a sector or an industry they're in, and how do they apply blockchain within that. So there's work to be done. We need the certainty around contracts. But I think that the US government, I probably take the view that I would be concerned if I saw the US Congress adopting something like the blockchain bill. Because I think that would have more of a risk of fossilizing things that would harm the technology. There could be areas around certainty of contracts that could be valuable, using federal acquisition to do this, but I don't think we need a single comprehensive law.
I would tend to agree, and also say that there's a first mover advantage for the de facto nature of standards. We've seen that over and over again in other technologies and other industries, that adoption fuels not just innovation, but learning and experience and skill. And just by virtue of trying it, you will understand what some of the different aspects are.
This is actually timely, because I mentioned I was in China yesterday, and I was a presenter on a panel on digital governance, appropriately. And it was, I think, relevant to this, because when you dig into the issue, what you hear from, the word you get from the Europeans is privacy, and Robert already mentioned that. The word that you get from the Chinese over and over and over again is security. And that means different things to different people, but you get a pretty clear idea of what it means to the Chinese government anyway. It's not clear what the American word is, if you had to have one word, but where we ended up was concern that this is going to be an issue. This is not just about blockchain, but writ large. This is the fragmentation of the internet, the large economic blocks, whether it's the EU or China, which counts as a block, and anybody else that it can persuade to join it, developing standards on data access, data localization, privacy, that are fundamentally in conflict with each other, is going to lead to effectively multiple internets, which would probably not be a good thing for economic growth and a lot of other things. It might be a good thing for national policy if that's what your goal is, but not otherwise. So is blockchain something that can sort of stay beneath all that radar and just sort of function anyway, or is it going to get caught up in all of that?
Well, I think ultimately it will get caught up in all of these issues. And these issues are much bigger than blockchain itself. China has, I would say, been very smart and aggressive about blockchain. I was just looking at some of the investments that China has made in a couple of cities alone, have made investments of over $3 billion just in the past couple of months in developing blockchain. I don't know exactly what that means.
These are government investments?
Yes, city governments alone. I don't know exactly where that money is going, but there's a lot of investment, and China is doing national standards on blockchain to further the interoperability, as I understand, of blockchain applications in China. And of course, these standards will probably keep proliferating as well in different countries, doing their own blockchain standards, just as countries have done their privacy laws. I was just in Buenos Aires, and Argentina and Brazil have just enacted their own privacy laws, modeling very much after the GDPR European law. So, we may see we're seeing already fragmentation in privacy laws, certainly, and other areas, but we may see more fragmentation also on blockchain standards. Hopefully that leads to some interoperability, but there is that umbrella still of laws and regulations that pertain to privacy and data access, security, data transfer, certainly, that I think we can basically help. We just have to navigate that.
I mean, it's critical. The Gartner estimates that the total value creation from blockchain by 2030 will be over $3 trillion. The current implementation and the biggest use cases are in financial services, but by 2030, they believe that the #1 use case will be around manufacturing, trade, supply chain, and the impacts on global GDP. If now you have sets of walled gardens between different regions or countries, that is not going to drive the same level of adoption. Yes, you can have, just like you can have an intranet, versus being on the web, you can have country-specific or company-specific blockchains, but the total value capture will never be the same unless you do have global standards that drive that interoperability.
And I'll just add, I mean, we've seen many cases, certainly around mobile standards and others, where countries have adopted national standards that were de facto trade barriers to try to create those walled gardens. And I think we need to do everything to resist that and have these global standards, allow the best uses of the best technology rise to the fore, whether it's a consortium or whether it's individual uses, enterprise uses, but strongly, if the history gives us any lessons to learn in this, we really need to resist national standards that wall out competitors. And that's particularly pernicious in large markets, where a large market may feel they can create a national standard and be large enough still to support an ecosystem, but in fact it blocks trading partners out of the market.
That is the concern about where there seem to be 3 of those, and that seems to be the direction we're heading. There's some comfort, and maybe Robert, you can comment on this. At the last WTO ministerial in Buenos Aires, they had 70+ countries agree to explore negotiations on digital trade issues, not just blockchain, but issues that would impact this technology. That seems to be slowly moving along. It will probably, at some point, if the stars align properly, turn into an actual negotiation. And the relevant parties so far are participating. Not all of them, but most of them. Are you optimistic about that? Or is this the right answer?
I'm cautious about. I am cautious about anything of consequence coming out of the WTO in the current environment. I would like to be able to, but what I think is the preferred alternative is what we've actually seen this week. I mean, we've now seen the 6 countries who are part of the TPP, the CPTPP, adopt that, which will go into effect at the end of the year. So those are setting principles around digital trade that are designed to restrict barriers. So there you get, the Japans, Canada, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, Singapores of the world standing up saying in areas, while it doesn't mention blockchain, it certainly has applicability, that you should resist the notion of walled gardens and you should allow more technologies to be used and user choice in the technology that they use across borders. So I think that those agreements will get there first. The USMCA will be there probably second. And then I think the WTO is a distant third.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think the WTO, I've been very impressed by the country's enthusiasm regarding this particular agreement, particularly those that you just mentioned. Singapore, Japan, Australia have been very much leading also the WTO process, and it seems like it is actually moving, and perhaps by Davos in January we'll have more progress on that. At the same time, I think in this space, we're talking a lot about what government should do and what standards government should set. There's a lot of industries already and companies that are driving and pushing standards. And I think it's very important for governments to work with these industry consortia and perhaps even follow kind of companies' lead. And that would be perhaps the best of all worlds, because these companies, we see HSBC in finance, we see FedEx in logistics. These are global companies and they have stake in all these markets. And so if they want certain standards, they certainly want interoperable global standards. And perhaps it's as the US government, it's very natural for us to kind of go behind those and support the industry consortia and work that way.
Okay, I want to give the audience a chance, so I have only one more question. Is this going to take all of our jobs away? Or am I safe for a while.
I think you're safe for a while. If anything, it's creating new jobs in the tech, and recent reports just in the last week that blockchain technology jobs have now, from a salary perspective, risen to some of the highest in the industry. So I think it's actually
so I shouldn't be worried.
Accelerator. Not yet.
Are you worried, Robert? You're going to lose your job?
No. Look, I'm not worried. Look, I think there will be higher levels of productivity around on all this. Who I think will potentially lose jobs in the system is what I think is the most pernicious part of what happens in global trade, which is around corruption. So I think as this is applied, and this is why when I first talked to you, I was so excited about what we can do. It's this pernicious cost that people, particularly people at the lowest end of the economic spectrum pay, particularly around the world, to support middlemen and have to pay people off to accomplish things that by rights they should be able to do on their own. For that group of people, I think that this will help cut that out, and it will allow governments to ensure that their citizens are getting what they pay for and not having to pay off people in corruption along the way.
So if the crooks lose their jobs, not a bad thing.
Yeah.
All right. Let's talk to hear from the audience, please. We have microphones someplace. Please identify yourself and ask a question, please. No speeches. We'll begin with you.
No speech. Angela Pashayan, PhD student at Howard University. My question is, which I think I know the answer, is there a place for blockchain in the BUILD Act? The act that just passed, Senator Bob Corker, BUILD?
Sure. I'll start. Sure, I think it is. I mean, it's all of, how do we create the kind of influence kind of globally and really put the U.S. in a position where we're helping support global development. And I think along with our trade agreements, blockchain is sort of a great way to deploy it. You can get better, smarter systems that can have errors corrected faster. So yes, I think it's a great example.
Okay. Yes, right here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Kelly Emmerich. I'm the executive director of a group called the Secure ID Coalition. And I want to address identity because it seems like that is the fundamental question of a successful blockchain is how do we authenticate identity in a way that's meaningful, especially when we're talking about things like health records or things that relate back to a naturalized human. What do you guys think about the identity mechanism and the schemes that are out there to address this question?
Go ahead.
I'll start. We see many mechanisms today for an individual network to identify the participants in that network, and they can set their own policies and use their own approaches for how they validate it. But we would agree that having a more consistent, uniform standard where that actually can extend from one network to another is critical for adoption and expansion. We've been doing the most work around the DID set of standards and using sovereign for self-sovereign identification at the individual level, but we also see the need to extend that to the corporate level for an enterprise or an entity, not just the individual. So that kind of tiered hierarchical approach to identity for know your customer as well as know your supplier would actually extend and accelerate that pretty dramatically. And we've seen very good results with that. The question is getting enough verifiers for those sets of credentialing, and it's an area that we think a government can play a very strong role in extending that kind of tops down. That of course assumes that you are associated with a given country and are not a displaced person, and there are other issues, but in highly banked societies as well as in places where you have a good model for citizen identification, we see a lot of great adoption.
Hi? No, nothing else? Okay. Here's some more over here in the corner.
Hi, Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. Last week I was at the UNCTAD summit, and it was interesting because there was an awful lot of stuff on blockchain, but one of the things that interested me was there were a lot of people trying to put it into education coming from Singapore and places like that. How can we popularize blockchain if it is going to be, you know, as important over the next 10 years as the World Wide Web was from the start of the 90s? You know, how does one get started on bringing it down so that it's everyone discusses it?
I mean, we certainly feel that education is essential, and we've been providing a lot of online direct access education, free badging. We did a countrywide effort in India to provide skills. We've also done work with Global Citizen on Challenge Accepted to look at the nonprofit space and how it could be much more beneficial for nonprofit. And you know, precisely to your point, the use case was how do you actually use blockchain and its provenance to be able to trace a donation and make sure that it gets to the intended recipients. You know, whenever there's a crisis, a lot of people give, but does that giving actually get to the people who need it? And we were able to do self-guided online education. One of the winners of that challenge actually had no blockchain experience prior to the start of this, you know, essentially online hackathon. So there are many resources out there for education, but the best advice I heard came from one of our partners, and they said, you know, you can't get fit by reading about exercise. You have to get out there and do it. Same thing is true of blockchain. You have to join a network. And you know, in my opinion, we'll be really successful when nobody talks about blockchain. They're just seeing the benefits. You know, talk about TCP/IP or HTTP when you talk about the internet. You know, you just go and use it. So we'll know we're really there when nobody asks me about what blockchain is anymore.
Kari, do you want to?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. We actually had this come up in our working group, is that, you know, once you see the benefit, you don't even ask what the underlying technology is anymore, and we just have to get there. And then, you know, perhaps raise those bars, as we were seeing in the chart with American companies, accelerating their adoption and testing and use of this technology. And certainly in certain cases, as we see in West Virginia and voting, for instance, very sensitive topic, and if we just test these out more and more, dare to do it in safe and secure environments, and then see the benefits. That's probably the best way to
But you do have to have an
off.
environment that's open to that,
Yes.
and encouraging for it.
Yeah,
Experimentation.
absolutely.
Which may
Gets
be
back to your
gets back to the
sandbox.
sandbox.
Yep.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you to explain what a sandbox was, but you did, so I won't. Here's another question.
Thank you. I'm Kelly Cox. I'm with the American National Standards Institute, commonly referred to as ANSI. And Bill,
One of our helpers, yes.
Exactly. You and Mary got together recently. So I was at your event for the last blockchain. So one of my comments is to China. As the U.S. representative to ISO, the International Organization for Standards, we have seen China become much more assertive, aggressive, with new work proposals, participation in a host of activities. So from a U.S. perspective, you know, we get concerned about that. So Caddy, to your working group, is it part of the current ISO TC 307 blockchain?
No, it was the working group here at CSIS, but I have
Oh,
been in touch
okay,
with those
all right.
people, certainly
Because
at
there is an
ISO.
ISO blockchain, and there probably could be a lot more U.S. participation. So I'm just kind of putting that out there. So thank you.
Okay, right here, Jack, go ahead.
Thank you. Is this on? Caroline Smith-DeWall, Food and Drug Administration. You mentioned the issues around international regulations, and I just wondered if you were aware there's currently work going on in the Codex Committee for food imports and exports, inspection and certification systems. A huge amount of food is traded with the use of export certifications, and governments right now are working to develop a common system or approach to transition to the use of paperless certificates. But it sounds like, are you aware that this work is going on right now?
I am from the work that we've been doing with Walmart and others on food trust. It also comes up, so in food trust, we are trying to use common standards, GS1, just for what products are involved, as well as origin. Right now, most of the legislation on food just requires country of origin, and if you really want to trace back on an issue that occurs with a contamination event, it's usually far more localized, or you wind up eliminating a whole lot of food you don't need to. So we're trying to go below what some of the current standards are. In the area of global trade, on Trade Lens, we are actually participating with a number of ports and customs authorities, including Customs and Border Patrol here, the Customs Authority in Canada and the Port of Montreal just joined, and there is a very clear view on the requirements for documentation that are necessary, whether it's phytosanitary certificates, other pieces. In general, a single shipment of flowers that we traced had 200 documents associated with it, most of them paper. So if you can actually take those documents, and we're talking about a low value, low margin, offering here, if you can digitize that, the amount of savings can be very substantial, and it does eliminate a lot of the theft and fraud when you're now starting to talk about higher value goods as well.
Okay, we have time for a couple more over here on the side.
Got it. My name's Howard Bursman, partner in GenCap Global Advisors. I just have a question. There was mention of this energy blockchain consortium here in the U.S. Is there a European analog that we know of, given all their regulatory intensity? Is there an effort being made in the EU or Great Britain or whatever to, is there a metaphor, an analog there?
We've been involved with Tenant, who's an energy provider in Europe, and there have been a number of areas where it's more looking not at the energy consortium itself, but carbon trading and carbon trading credits, and how to look at that in terms of the total, CO2 production and other things. Those are some of the ones that I have been involved in. I don't know if you've seen others.
I haven't seen in Europe this energy consortium, but perhaps this consortium that we pointed out has some European members. Just have to look.
Okay, we have one more, if there is one. Doesn't have to be. Yes, over here. You get the last word, or the second to last
Thanks.
word.
Thank you. So my name is Carl Schonander. I'm with the Software and Information Industry Association, and thanks for doing this. So one quick comment, although I wasn't supposed to. Cross-border data flows, absolutely critical. This makes it even more so. But I wanted to ask a question about the national situation, the United States. There seems to be consensus that if this technology is going to be scaled up, we need interoperability. So my question is, within the United States, if you can even wall us off, because it's hard to do that, but within the United States, to achieve interoperability, what are the impediments? Is it already happening organically through the private marketplace? If it's not, is there any role for public policy to play or not? Thanks.
I mean, in my experience, most of the activity for interoperability is coming from actual live projects. I would tend to agree that you don't want to regulate your way into a technology solution. You should find the right fit for that purpose. And wherever we're seeing the need for networks to connect with each other, you mentioned WeTrade. Just this week, was announced a connection with the trade network that is based out of Hong Kong and Asia. And those are focusing directly on how do they get interoperability between those two networks. So when there's live use cases, it's almost client-led or user-led, and it usually comes up, in my opinion, with the best solution than when you say, you must integrate without knowing exactly what you're integrating for.
So I think there's been an enormous amount of focus on that. The best answer would actually be a common standard, so you don't need the interoperability because it's just one more piece of friction. But until that point, either by adoption or de facto uses, I think there's a lot of activity already in the standards bodies and in open source on driving interoperability.
Okay, I'm glad you asked that because it was one of mine and I didn't get to it, so that was great. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you for arranging.
It's always